Om Jnana Timidandasya Jnananjana Shalakaya Chakshurum Militam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha Shri Chaitanya Manobishtam Stapitam Yena Bhutale Swayam Rupa Kadamayam Darati Swapadantikam Vandeham Shri Guru Shri Uta Padakamalam Shri Gurun Vaishnavamsha Shri Rupam Sagachatam Sagana Raghunatam Vitam Tam Sajivam Sadvaitam Savadutam Paridhara Sahitam Krishna Chaitanya Devam Shri Radha Krishna Padan Sagana Lalita Shri Vishakhan Vitamscha Hey Krishna Karuna Sindhu Dinabandhu Jagatpate Gopesha Gopika Kanta Radha Kanta Namostate Tapta Kanchana Gaurangi Radhe Vrindavaneshwari Vrishabhanu Sute Devi Pranamami Hari Priye Vanchakalpa Trubhyascha Kripa Sindhubhyevacha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha Namo Om Vishnu Padaya Krishna Prastaya Bhutale Srimate Bhakti Vedanta Swaminiti Namine Namaste Saraswate Devi Gauravani Pracharine Nirvishesha Shunyavari Paschatya Deshatarine Jai Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadara Shri Vasari Gaura Bhakta Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, everyone. So, welcome to our continued study of this most glorious Bhagavad Gita. So today we'll be discussing the second half of chapter 16. The title of the chapter is The Divine and Demoniac Natures. And last week we discussed in pretty good detail the various characteristics of the divine, which is presented in verses 1 through 3. And then the characteristics of the demoniac nature. And that characteristic of the demoniac nature will continue for most of this section. And then we'll conclude with the explanation of how to uplift oneself from this very degraded mentality. And the summary of the mentality is that the demoniac acts according to their own desires. Whatever will satisfy the senses, it will do, without any regard to Shastra, which advises us what is good for us and what is bad for us. And this is the demoniac mentality. And so we know it to be very destructive, not only for themselves and their migration from body to the lower life forms, but also for the world at large. Because of the activities that are undertaken and the collateral damage, if you will, from such actions. And so it's a very dangerous situation. And what's maybe shocking when we read this chapter is this is like normal course for every society at large, these characteristics, these activities. And it's almost unbelievable that how could this be demoniac? It virtually describes the whole of the world. Well, yes, that is the case in the age of Kali Yuga. In the age of Satyuga, you'll see virtually none of this. Heck, even at the beginning of Kali Yuga, when Parikshit Maharaj was ruling, there was virtually no activities beyond the pursuit of self-realization, working in perfect varnashram dharma. So the degraded situation we see today is not an eternal situation, but it is a characteristic of the time today. But by the power of devotional service, one can uplift themselves and those at large. And so that is the silver lining to this description of a very, we can say dark dynamic. But this is the reality. So we'll continue now reading from the 13th verse. 13 through 15 are presented together. And the verse reads as such: The demoniac person thinks So much wealth do I have today, and I will gain more according to my schemes. So much is mine now, and it will increase in the future more and more. He is my enemy, and I have killed him, and my other enemies will also be killed. I am the Lord of everything. I am the enjoyer. I am perfect, powerful, and happy. I am the richest man, surrounded by aristocratic relatives. There is none so powerful and happy as I am. I shall perform sacrifices. I shall give some charity, and thus I shall rejoice. In this way, such persons are deluded by ignorance. So, we see this I. No idea who is the real doer. The demoniac do not believe that the Lord is the reason behind their success, but they think that they themselves are the doer, and it leads to a very prideful situation. You can see what one is willing to do, even kill their enemies. Why? Because the enemies get in the way of their pursuits of various sense enjoyment. But they'll do some charity and some sacrifices, often out of a show, just to make themselves feel good or look good in the public at large, but not for the purpose of self-realization. So this is the mentality. The devotee has no enemies. They think anyone acting like an enemy to them is simply sent by Krishna to help them change and improve and purify. And so they don't, hate the instrument of their karma, if you will. So we see the distinction in this mentality. It's very, very I-centric and full of pride. In 16, Krishna continues, thus, perplexed by various anxieties and bound by a network of illusions, they become too strongly attached to sense enjoyment and fall down into hell. So what is the achievement of this demoniac mentality? It is not success. It is not, this is my inspiration to push myself to the top. In fact, one falls down into hell. And that's a very startling statement. So why? Well, because the desires are so strong, Krishna says, become too strongly attached to sense enjoyment. So the desires, the material sense desires, are so strong that there are no limits to what one will do to achieve those results. And that means one is willing to even commit bad karma, steal, perform crimes to achieve their sense desires. And thus that willingness to do whatever it takes leads to so much bad karma. And we know, what is the result of bad karma? It is simply suffering in the hellish planets. Right? So one must pay for all of their activities. That is the nature of the world. So there is a reaction for every activity. So driven by these sense desires, one suffers future reactions, and that takes them down to the lowest planets. Right? So one who has riches, we know, they want more. Right? They assess their current situation. Srila Prabhupada says he thinks of only how much assessment he just has now and schemes to engage the stock of wealth further and further. So he looks at what I have and wants more and more. How to improve my land, my family, my home, my bank account, Srila Prabhupada explains. So there's no satisfaction. Right? The mentality of the rich person is that the endeavor alone has led to all of this. And Prabhupada explains the reality in the purport, which is due to their past good deeds. He has been blessed by Krishna with some abilities to generate wealth in this material world. But it is due to the past good deeds that they currently are enjoying some wealth. As we know, good deeds leads to good reactions. Bad deeds leads to bad reactions. It's a very simple formula. So the wealth they have today is simply a function of their past good activities. So, and thus Krishna has empowered them to be able to generate some wealth. But the bad deeds they are doing today will lead to bad reactions in the future. So it'll go the other way. Right? So, but the demoniac, they do not believe in the laws of karma. That my good looks, my good intelligence, my strength, my high birth, it's all due to my past good actions. So let me do more good actions so I can continue at least in this realm. They have lost such understanding. They think, no, I am the doer alone. I have created my own. But they don't see how their good fortune is a function of their past good deeds. So they don't try to continue performing good activities. They've lost their understanding. Right? And so this is the pride of the demons. They'll say, why are you seeking God elsewhere? You all are yourselves God. Srila Prabhupada writes in the purport, he says, why are you seeking God elsewhere? You are all yourselves God. Whatever you like, you can do. Don't believe in God. Throw away God. God is dead. These are the demoniac's preachings. We hear this, maybe not in so extreme, but you sentimentalist, because you can't do anything on your own, you turn to God. Right? This is the very demoniac mentality that Krishna is describing, millions of years ago. Remember, this Bhagavad Gita was spoken long, long ago. This isn't a current events assessment. This is something that was spoken long ago. So this mentality, it is there eternally, but we see it more prevalent today than in prior ages. Right? And we have many examples in our Shastra. Ravana is a great example. Right? He did not believe in Shastra. He took to Shastra to be able to achieve his power. But he thought, you don't need to follow the Vedic principles to go to the higher planets. I'll build a staircase to go to the higher planets, to the heavenly planets. You don't need the Vedic Shastras. Of course, his attempts were failed, which all attempts of the demoniac ultimately are failed, including their own enjoyment. The demoniac will never enjoy, ultimately, though they want to so badly and are working so hard for it, because they'll continue to suffer the results of their activities that are leading them, driven by these intense desires. And thus, Krishna says, thus perplexed by various anxieties. This is the position of the demoniac. Always perplexed, so much anxiety. Who is going to usurp my wealth? How am I going to get more? Who is stealing from me? These anxieties plague that. If you study, the old monarchs, not in our, Vedic system, but in general, you see they're always worried about who is trying to poison me, who is trying to get after me, who wants my kingdom. They're full of anxieties. So this is the nature of the demoniac. 17. Self-complacent and always impudent, deluded by wealth and false prestige. They sometimes proudly perform sacrifices in name only, without following any rules or regulations. So sometimes you'll see the demoniac under the guise of spirituality. They go, oh, maybe they're doing something good. But the mentality is completely awry. They think they are God, that they are the worshipful personalities. But yeah, they'll do some sacrifices for show only, wanting some prestige or big titles, my name on a building, that sort of stuff. So there's no purity for the purpose of their sacrifice. Their goal is, again, fully around the pride and conceit, right, that Krishna described as the 6 qualities of the demoniac. This arrogance, pride, conceit, those things are what drive one to even do sometimes some sacrifices, some religious activities. Okay? 18. Bewildered by false ego. Strength, pride, lust, and anger, the demons become envious of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, who is situated in their own bodies and in the bodies of others, and blaspheme against the real religion. And so here comes the very, sort of conclusive and very dangerous result of this philosophy, is that one ultimately becomes envious of Krishna. the Supreme Lord, our loving Father, our ever maintainer and protector, one becomes envious. And envy, we know, it leads to hatred. And hatred leads to, very sinful and antagonistic activities against that person. So the envy is there. Why? Because of this pride and conceit and arrogance. They cannot accept that someone else is superior to them. That they are, fully dependent on somebody else. They think they are independent, successful, and powerful. So they cannot accept this fact. And we see this in, the likes of Hiranyakashipu, Ravana, Shishupal, so many of these personalities we've seen. But today, all around us, we see Hiranyakashipus. Again, deluded, bewildered by that false ego, by some strength and this pride. Ultimately, their lust, their strong sense desires. They think that they are the best and the supreme, and thus they cannot tolerate the statements of somebody else being supreme, right? And this is the nature of envious. So, we've talked about this in the past, but when we have envy, we cannot tolerate to hear the glories of somebody else, because immediately we think, why are they glorifying them? Why not me? I have done this, I have done that. So this is always a good indicator for ourselves of maybe if there's some envy in our heart, even in our pursuit of spirituality. Sometimes our heart becomes saddened when we hear the glories of somebody else. That is a sign that there is some envy in our heart. We're not happy for their progress, but we are disturbed because we are not being glorified. And so when we feel like this, sometimes we should immediately, identify it and say, oh, this is some envy. This is not a good situation. The spiritual master glorifies, another God brother or God sister, and we become, disturbed in our heart. But that is not the mentality of a pure devotee. And so this envy, sometimes in devotional life, it develops the more we progress. Early on, we have no envy because we understand we are so fallen and everybody around us is superior and more advanced. But as we progress ourselves, sometimes we start to think now I've arrived. And this feeling of envy can enter the heart. And so the telltale sign, when we feel some pain in the heart upon hearing the glories of somebody else. Why would we feel? They're glorifying them. They're not saying anything bad about us. There's pain. That's envy. It's a good way to symptomize it. And, we see, particularly in Chaitanya Charitamrita, so many wonderful examples of how the pure devotee handles the glorification of another devotee. And one, example I always like to look to is the devotees at Ramakeli. When Chaitanya Mahaprabhu was glorifying Rupa and Sanatan Goswami so extensively for their display of humility and their mood of surrender, the devotees, all the associates who were observing, they went into ecstasy, seeing how much mercy Rupa and Sanatan Goswami were obtaining, even getting the lotus feet of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu upon their head. The other devotees were ecstatic and happy for them. They were not thinking, why am I not getting this? Why not me? So this is the activity of the pure devotee. But the demoniac, we know, full of envy. Full of envy. And Vishnu Chakravarti Thakur explains further, not only do they envy Krishna, but they also envy the devotees. They find faults in the devotees. They criticize the activities. See how they're doing this and doing that? They cannot tolerate the progress of the devotees, how all the wonderful qualities are coming out. So this fault finding is a key mentality of the demoniac. And it is born out of envy. And sometimes even, again, in our own devotional life, we look to the faults of others. And that is a sign of envy. And it is a demoniac tendency, though we may be in the pursuit of devotional service. And so we must be very mindful to rid ourselves of this tendency to find faults. Remember, Krishna doesn't look at our faults He looks at only what we do good. So if Krishna is looking at only our good, we should also only see the good in others. But unfortunately, we amplify the faults of others and subdue the good. But instead, we should take the opposite approach. We should completely ignore the faults, not having this envious mentality. So this fault-finding nature is something that we can really work to eradicate from our consciousness. But the demoniac are full of it, full of envy. And again, this envy is born really out of pride, right? Cannot tolerate or think that anybody else is great. Nobody can be better than us. Any such person becomes their enemy, their rival, right? And Prabhupada says very strongly at the end, I quote, he makes a plan to cut him down by his own power. That is the mentality of the demoniac, not being able to, due to their own pride, tolerate that somebody else could be, more powerful. So how does Krishna reciprocate with such demoniac personalities? So he discusses in 19 and 20 Krishna's reciprocation. We know Ye tamam pratyante tam sataiva bhajamiham. Krishna says, I reciprocate according to the degree of one's surrender. So Krishna reciprocates accordingly. He says, those who are envious and mischievous, who are the lowest among men, I perpetually cast them into the ocean of material existence, into various demoniac species of life. So the result of this demoniac mentality is to perpetually live in the demoniac species of life, the lower life forms, even down to the hellish planets. And how long? Perpetually. Forever. Right? Not in Hawaii or some beautiful beaches, but forever. You can go on mute. So, this position is one that one achieves, again, perpetually. And the envious demoniac people, they don't think about their next life. When this statement is said, they're not worried about it. That's all nonsense. They only see the body. They think this is it. Everything ends at the end of this life, so I'll just enjoy this life to the fullest. I have so much wealth and power and fame. Nobody can disturb my enjoyment. Right? So not thinking, who is the arranger of my next life? They're not thinking that Krishna, with whom they're envious of, is actually going to direct them into their next lower life forms. So they may think that they have control, but their next body is fully dependent on the actions they've done today and the laws of material nature under the superintendent of Krishna. Right? We know we did not pick our parents today. We did not pick our form, our body today. So certainly our next life will also not pick. It is going to be handed to us based on our activities. But this the demoniac do not believe in. And thus they will be suffering because they don't make the smart decision to take good actions. So the whole demoniac mentality of I am the doer is completely upended. They are forced into these lower life forms based on the laws of action. Krishna is not discriminating against them. He is not being biased. He is simply responding exactly according to their actions. Right? So while Krishna does pick where we go, it is based on our own activities. So we are ultimately the responsible party for those activities. So Krishna continues his discussion of his reciprocation by saying in verse 20, attaining repeated birth amongst the species of demoniac life, O son of Kunti, such persons can never approach me. Gradually they sink down to the most abominable type of existences. Right? So this is why they take birth in the form of a hog, eating stool, in the form of, different life forms that have very challenging life experiences, standing as a tree all day long with no engagement. These lower life forms have a very difficult experience for the living entity. But this is the result. So as long as one has this envious mentality, there's no chance to purify, and will suffer eternally. And Prabhupada says Krishna is never merciful to the demoniac. But we know Krishna is all merciful. So how can Krishna not be merciful to demoniac? So Prabhupada explains, and Arjuna is wondering the same thing. Why eternally? He's thinking you could save them from this suffering. So why don't you? So Krishna explains that yes, I could save them, but I don't because they don't want me to. Krishna doesn't interfere with their independence. He's sitting there in their heart also as Paramatma, waiting to inspire them. But because they don't want, they actually have developed hatred of Krishna through this envy. And Krishna does not force their righteousness. It must come from one's own desire. So, because they have no desire to get out, Krishna lets them stay forever in this very suffering position. So this is also his mercy, because he is fulfilling their desire. Right? So their perpetual position here is actually the desire of the demoniac. They don't want to know Krishna, they want to be far, far away from him. So Krishna says, okay, you can stay far, far away. No problem. That is your desire. But he also says, if you ever desire to change your position, I am sitting in your heart as Paramatma, ready to guide you back. So he does not give up on any living entity. But their perpetual position here is based on the perpetual desire of the demoniac person. So Krishna is still all merciful, though one resides here, because he is simply fulfilling their desires. Right? So since they have no desire to get out, Krishna allows them to stay forever. So now, Arjuna hearing this thinks, wow, this is very shocking news. How can people ever get rid of this demoniac mentality? They are perpetually cast into this cycle of birth and death in all these low life forms. Surely people after hearing this will want to become free, will want to improve the dynamic. But it looks hopeless. So is there some hope? So based on this idea, Krishna now is going to speak the next verses. 21. He's going to identify Krishna. What is the core gateway to this very difficult position? He says, there are 3 gates leading to hell: lust, anger, and greed. Every man should give these up, for they lead to the degradation of the soul. So Krishna says, if you don't want this position perpetually cast into the hellish condition, what must we do? We must give up these 3 gateways to hell: lust, anger, and greed. And if we see all the demoniac personalities in our Shastra, they're full of lust, Ravana, Hiranyakashipu, full of anger and greed. This is the mentality. So the sane person, as Prabhupada writes, must give up these 3 because they lead to hell, degradation of the soul's opportunity to achieve a higher outcome. And it all starts with lust. With lust, this intense desire for sense enjoyment, anger arises when our desires are not satisfied, when we don't get what we want. We become angry. But what happens if we get what we want? Well, if we get what we want, greed develops. We want more. We're not satisfied with what comes. And ultimately, that'll not get satisfied, and it'll lead right back to anger. So lust leads to this anger and greed. And from greed comes illusion, this loss of discrimination. Because I so badly, desperately want my material activity, my material sense desire, I lose discrimination of what is right and what is wrong. I'm willing to even steal and kill to satisfy my sense desires. So I become illusion from right and wrong. Born out of this, greed. So lust, anger, greed leads to illusion. Right? This illusion, after having lost what is right from wrong, it leads to pride. Forget it. I do whatever I want. I am the controller of my domain. What we saw in verses 13 through 15. I'm willing to even kill my enemy who stands in the way of my sense desires. So this illusion, it leads to pride. And the result of all of this, it ends in envy of Krishna. So this lust, anger, greed leads to illusion and pride. And it combines into the sixth enemy of the mind, and that is envy. And it's really a combination of this lust, anger, greed, pride, and illusion. So when we talk about the six enemies of the mind, these are them. But it all starts with lust, anger, and greed. And this envy, it is the most intense because it combines all five of these other enemies. It's hard to conquer. So these three, plus the other three that result from it, must be conquered. And again, how do we start? If we start by controlling our lust, then anger and greed will dissipate, delusion and pride will dissipate, and of course our envy. So one must give up these three in order to avoid gliding down into the hellish life forms. That is our only option. So Krishna now says in 22, the man who escapes these three gates of hell, O son of Kunti, performs acts conducive to self-realization and thus gradually attains the supreme destination. So here Krishna says, the choice is ours. There is a better option, the supreme destination. If we don't want to be cast perpetually into hell, into the lower life forms, then one has to escape these three gateways to hell. And the result is one is performing activities that are beneficial for self-realization and thus achieves the supreme destination. Right? So we must become free from these enemies to human life, as Prabhupada writes. He says these are the enemies to human life in the very first line of the purport. And they are truly enemies to ourselves. And so how to overcome this? Remember, back to escaping the banyan tree from chapter 15. We must detach from the material world. We must control our material desires. This weapon of detachment must be utilized, sharpened by the good intelligence to know what is good for me, what is bad for me. We must control this lust, control these sense desires. Because if we do, then again, anger and greed, pride and illusion, and ultimately envy will dissipate, because it all originates from lust. But unfortunately, the whole of society is simply encouraging our greed and lust. Everything we see, all the advertisement is all focused on get more money, get more sense desires, right? Take out a home equity loan and build yourself a spa-like bathroom. It's constantly fueling these ideas, keeping up with the Joneses, trying to keep up with the status in society. Okay? So this conquering is very important. So how to do it? It begins and ends with practice of devotional service. By the practice of devotional service, by rendering devotional service to Krishna, we will ultimately conquer our material sense desires. By gravitating to a higher taste, we'll lose the taste of these lower sense desires, right? Param drishtva nivartate, that we saw all the way back in the second chapter. Right? So some practical tips, service to devotees is a very powerful way to curb this pride, and our envy. When we feel this envy of somebody, go render some service to them. Help support them. Become closer. It will cure our pride, and our envy. This envy is conquered by giving up ultimately this sense gratification. If we have no desires for ourselves, then we'll never feel disrespected, not given the proper acknowledgement. And so, the Prabhupada always comments that the most intense sense desires that kills our pursuit to self-realization is the sex desire, right? It is the really the force that is driving all of society. It is the root cause of our lust, and it's our strongest bind to the material world. So we must conquer that, and we must be determined to overcome it. Make a plan and stick to it, because it's a very deeply rooted and powerful force, all these sense desires. And we know in order to conquer something very strong and powerful, we need a powerful force. And that powerful force is devotional service. Pursuing self-realization is the key to success. Realizing I am part and parcel of Krishna, and thus engaging in devotional service. By the power of bhakti, one is assured the ability to overcome this lust. Srila Prabhupada writes in Srimad Bhagavatam that by studying Srimad Bhagavatam, one will overcome their material desires. They will push them out of the heart so that pure devotional service can manifest. Right? So to suppress this lust, we do it with the power of devotional service. When we serve Krishna's senses, our desire to serve our own senses dissipate. We only have two choices, either to serve our own desires or serve Krishna's desires. To serve Krishna's senses or our own senses. Those are the only two choices we have. So by engaging in devotional service, we can then very effectively conquer these three gateways to hell: lust, anger, and greed. And so when we do, then one will achieve the supreme destination. Success is guaranteed. So it is not a hopeless situation. It is full of hope. And Krishna now will conclude the chapter with some further understanding, both 1 and 23 saying what happens if we don't, and 24 what happens if we do follow. So 23, he who discards scriptural injunctions and acts according to his own whims attains neither perfection nor happiness, nor the supreme destination. So the result of following Shastra, three things: no perfection, no happiness, and no supreme destination. This is the result of not following Shastra. Shastra is given, our Vedic principles are given in a way that all human society can take to it, regardless of where we are, regardless of our position. There is something that all of us can do to make progress towards self-realization and towards this supreme destination. It is within reach of every living entity. And so it is available, but if we don't, we'll never find perfection of life. If we don't follow these Vedic injunctions, there is no hope. And who is the lowest of mankind? Krishna spoke lowest of mankind in a couple of verses prior. Prabhupada writes in the purport that one who knows these Shastric injunctions, but knowingly violates them. They know what to do, but they don't do it. That is the worst of offenders. At least the ignorant don't know. I know, slitting the throat of an animal is bad, but I still do it. I know consuming intoxication, smoking or drinking or taking drugs, I know it's bad, but I still do it. This is the worst of offenders because they have the knowledge, but yet do not do it. So the result is no happiness, no perfection. Right? They'll follow their lustful desires, and thus anger and greed will develop, and they'll perform many, many bad actions to achieve some cheap, quick happiness, but all will result is perpetual suffering. Right? We know, we'll hear it a little bit later, happiness in the mode of ignorance, it is sweet initially and bitter in the end. That is the nature of it. And so that's what results. So much effort, but no gain. Just lower regions of the universe. So Srila Prabhupada writes, makes a very important point that I just wanted to read in the purport here. I'll just find it again. He says, but even if he follows the rules and regulations and moral principles and ultimately does not come to the stage of understanding the Supreme Lord, then all his knowledge becomes spoiled. And even if he accepts the existence of God, if he does not engage himself in the service of Lord, his attempts are spoiled. Therefore, one should gradually raise himself to the platform of Krishna consciousness and devotional service. It is then and there that he can attain the highest perfectional stage, not otherwise. So it's very important that even these preliminary Vedic principles, even our Varnashram Dharma, performing our occupational duties, if it does not conclude in devotional service to Krishna, all those efforts are spoiled. It will not produce the desired result. So it must bring one to the platform of devotional service. Otherwise, that effort is spoiled. And so it's a very important point that perfection of even the occupational duties is not sufficient until it brings one to service to Krishna. So Krishna concludes by saying, one should therefore understand what is duty and what is not duty by the regulation of the scriptures. Knowing such rules and regulations, one should act so that he may be gradually elevated. So Krishna gives the conclusive now. What to do? Accept Shastra. Let that dictate what we should do and what we should not do, not our own whimsical desires. Follow the guidance of Shastra, because if you do, you'll find perfection, you'll find happiness, you'll find eternal life of bliss and knowledge. But if you don't, he's already told us what will happen, right? So be divine by following the injunctions of Shastra. Use our intelligence that we begin in this human form of life to inquire what is good for me, what is bad for me, and thus follow them accordingly. And knowing them will gradually be elevated. Krishna gives assurance. So Shastra makes it very clear what will help us and what will hurt us. And if we follow, it'll end. And again, all these rules and regulations, they must conclude in us coming to learn who is Krishna and what is my relationship with him, and thus engage in that relationship, devotional service, and thus achieve the result of that relationship, Krishna Prema, eternal life of bliss and happiness. So this is the key to overcoming this very degraded situation, to escape the dangerous dynamic of the demoniac personality nature. It is very doable by the power of devotional service, and Krishna is making it known to all of us, and by the mercy of Srila Prabhupada, we are now having this knowledge and can pursue it and share it with others. But no, if we just stop at the mode of goodness, doing things according to right and wrong, and it doesn't end in devotional service, there's every potential that we will fall back down because of the ever-present risk of lust that can transition into anger and greed. So even coming just to the mode of goodness, Prabhupada says, we must come to the mode of goodness and then transcend, must go beyond and render devotional service. That is the key to achieving the permanent result. So even the mode of goodness, we see most of the demoniac persons today who are enjoying wealth and fame, they were acting in the platform of mode of goodness previously. Thus they have these great facilities. But now we see the condition of the demoniac action. So we know that coming to the mode of goodness alone is not sufficient. We must go further. We must go above and beyond to the platform of devotional service to achieve this perfection. And just in conclusion, we know the fundamental defect in this demoniac mentality. It is this pride, conceit, arrogance that leads one to this very dangerous position, and it manifests itself starting with lust, which then spirals us down into a dangerous situation in the life of demoniac tendencies and a spoiled opportunity to achieve a better, perfect life. Thank you very much. Srila Prabhupada ki. Jayananta Koti Vaishnavrinda ki. Any questions or discussion today? Okay. If there are no questions, then
Hare Krishna Prabhuji.
yes, Roji. Yes, Roji.
Hare Krishna Prabhuji. Thank you for the wonderful class. It was really soothing and hypnotic. I'm going through a lot of stress right now. I mean, I'm working from home and listening to your lecture, but I would just like to thank you for these wonderful lectures. It's really uplifting and very inspirational. Hare
Hare
Krishna Prabhuji. Thank you.
Hare Krishna. Wish you the best and take the devotional service. It'll cure your challenges.
Hare Bol.
Hare.
Hare Bol.
Hare Krishna Prabhuji, Dhanavad.
Glories to Srila Prabhupada, and glories to you for the nectarious class. I feel we are saved, Prabhuji. Thank you very much. Because of saving us. So, only thing is to serve Srila Prabhupada as much as possible. Thank you. Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna. We're very grateful for Srila Prabhupada presenting this in an unvarnished way. He doesn't sugarcoat anything because we need it. We need it as it is. We're very grateful because Srila Prabhupada, he could have made it more palatable, but it would not have been helpful to us. The stark reality is important. So, as you said, very grateful to Srila Prabhupada for guiding us and saving us. Thank you, Prabhupada.
Prabhupada used like a words like bullet, as it is.
We need it. Yes, thank you, brother. Okay. If not, so next week we'll discuss chapter 17. Chapter 17 will be the last chapter of new information, and then 18 will be a summary of everything we heard, just like chapter 2 was a summary. Krishna will conclude chapter 18 with a summary, so chapter 17 we'll discuss next week. Thank you very much. Srila Prabhupada ki Jai, Ananta Koti Vaishnavrinda ki Hare Krishna.
Yeah.